Hello there guys. In a recent video I built Tamiya's 1/35th scale Centaur with added photo etch for the deep wading equipment. This is how I left the model in the last video with the pre-shading down. In this video I'm going to finish it off. Now there are plenty of reference photos of Centaurs around, including one of these schemes which is in the Tamiya box, which is Hunter. But what's seen much less commonly is what we can see in this reference photo here behind the Centaur. It's a metal trailer or sledge called a Porpoise, and it's basically designed to allow the Centaurs, Shermans and Churchills to drag ashore more ammunition during the D-Day landings. As you can see, they're a very slimline sledge, and the reason for that is they're designed to fit between the tracks of the tanks I mentioned, so that when they go on the landing craft, the trailers don't take up any extra space. So the tank at the back will have its trailer somewhere off to the side, but then the tank in front of that will have its trailer under the rear tank, and then this next tank will have its trailer under the second from the back tank, and so on. So it's quite an interesting little system, something I didn't know about before, and I like the idea of it just being dragged behind the vehicle to bring this ammunition to shore through the surf. There are a couple of resin kits available of the Porpoise, but I decided to go for the 3D printed option, which I found on Thingiverse. This is a 1:100 scale model, so I needed to scale it up, but it was sufficiently detailed that I was able to do that without too much of a problem. It's quite a nice model because it has a multi-part model for FDM printers, but a single part model for resin printers, so there's no construction required. And it has both open versions with these separate hatches and the closed versions with the hatches battened down. I threw the model at my Creality Mage Pro 3D printer, and this is what it came out with. Here you can see the hatches here on the open version, and we've got the closed up version as well, with those handles moved into position to actually hold those hatches down, which is quite a nice touch. There is a small amount of sanding to do because of course we have to use supports for resin models, so those nubs there need sanding away, but overall I think that's going to make a nice addition to our Centaur. The attachment points will need scratch pooling as well, of course. Back to the Centaur, and although most vehicles on D-Day were painted in olive drab or SCC 15, these particular Centaurs were in the SCC 2 brown. So that's the colour I used, directly from AK Real Colours. As you can see, I've gone quite lightly here over the model because some of that pre-shading is still quite strongly showing through. But in reality it doesn't look quite as stark as it does in the video. I've also given the metal plating around the turret hatch and the metal plating around the rear vent a different colour. This is SCC 15 green, because I figured that these were added at the last minute and therefore were more likely to be painted in the standard colour of the time than in the brown. I then gave the rear and the front of the tank and all of the sides of the turret a coat of VMS gloss varnish in preparation for the decals. These are the only locations that require decals and therefore the only location I applied the varnish. Later on I may well use the varnish again to get this sort of wet effect if I decide to have this Centaur coming out of the surf, but for now I left everything else unvarnished. Of course the degree markings on the turret are the most prominent decals here on this model. It wasn't until they were down and dry that I could add some of the final pieces around the exterior of the turret. I did find these decals quite difficult to put down. They're quite thick, and although they do have holes in them to go around the major shapes on the turret, it still was a bit fiddly. This back one here in particular I did mess up. The other thing is, on the front of the turret where I put that canvas protection for the gun mechanism, I had to cut that decal in pieces and make it fit around, because of course it should go all the way across. The marking I decided to go for is Hunter. The two options in the instructions are very similar anyway. Next up was detail painting. I used Vallejo metal colour steel for several of the details, including the tow cables. You might remember from the previous video that I replaced the kit parts with some metal wire for this. The tools got a coat of the same paint. And a random Vallejo model colour green for that canvas protection on the gun. Then everything was given a coat of VMS matte varnish to protect the paintwork, seal in the decals, and really matte everything down nicely. While I was busy doing all of that painting, I painted the Porpoise SCC-15. I scratch built a simple towing mechanism for the Porpoise using a brass rod and a couple of spare parts. It wasn't 100% clear to me how these attach, but I don't believe it was via chains. I think the chains were simply used to pull them onto the ships in the first place. The instructions for the photo etch give us some wires that we need to add. I love how part 10 here looks quite large on the instruction sheet, blown up like that. But when we see that on the model, it is, to say the least, a little bit smaller. Either way, with a bit of difficulty and some super glue, I used some thread which is normally used for ship rigging or aerial wires to replicate those wires on the rear deck. When I'm doing this, I typically use lengths way longer than I need, and then when the super glue is dried, just snip them back with a pair of scissors to the required length. The tracks had been airbrushed a mixture of black and a red-brown colour. The same Vallejo metal steel colour was used to give some shine to the guide horns there, and dry brush on the outside of the tracks on the raised areas. The teeth on the dry sprockets received a similar treatment. Now, I said in my previous video that I wasn't sure what those U-shaped brackets are on the engine deck. A couple of people commented and said they're probably for stowage, so I thought that seems reasonable. Rather than just have generic stowage, I thought I'd head over to Quartz 3D and see if I could find anything specific. And I found this ammo box here, which is for the howitzer used by the Centaur. So I downloaded that for less than a couple of quid, printed out a few of them, and I think they'll fit nicely there on that engine deck. Next up was a pin wash using oil paints. I didn't use any gloss coat for this, simply the matte varnish which had previously been applied. The sepia oil paint from Abteilung 502 was thinned with odourless thinner and applied quite thickly this time. I think the sepia makes a nice contrast with the light brown colour. Although I'm not too worried about any excess because it can be cleaned up, I don't want to get masses of this everywhere because you can get tide marks from the thinner. You can see that's doing a good job there of highlighting those details. This detail here on the side is why I didn't want to add the wheels just yet, because we've got quite a lot there that the pin wash will bring out. Finally, once it had dried out for an hour or so, I blended any excess using a brush dampened in odourless thinner. Now, I wasn't really sure what weathering to apply to the Centaur because ultimately I feel like I might want to make a beach diorama and have it coming out of the surf dragging the Porpoise. So in that case it won't be heavily covered in mud. But at the same time, I don't really want to build that diorama at the moment. I don't really feel like messing with resin at the moment. So I decided to go for some light weathering only. One technique that I've used more recently and I really quite like is an oil splattering technique. Using the same oil paint as the pin wash but slightly thinner and just speckling it all over the vehicle to give a kind of patina variation to surface texture to the model. Hopefully you can see here, even though it's not quite dry yet, the effect that has had on the surface. It's just broken it up a little bit. Some of those splatters are a bit too big, but overall it breaks that monotonous brown colour. This kit comes with two figures, and I must say, especially considering this is a fairly old kit from 1999, they are really good. There's a great level of detail to them. I really like the faces in particular, and they did make the painting process a lot easier. So we can see the figure on the left there has been given a coat of a dark green colour. The figure on the right is going to be wearing a sort of khaki coloured overall with the leather jacket on top of that. Before those base colours were put down, the figures were primed in grey primer and then shot from below with black to give a sort of fake shadow effect. Both of those base colours were Tamiya Acrylics airbrush with lacquer thinner. Then Vallejo model colour was used for the leather protective jacket on one of the figures. First with a brown colour, and then while the paint was still wet, with a saddle brown colour to give some highlighting and some shade variation. AK acrylics were used for the skin. This set actually came with a range of 5 flesh colours for faces, but to be honest I've never been able to even do 3 and make them stand out, never mind 5. So I just stuck with 2, the base flesh and the light flesh. I think the thing I've learnt the most here for painting figures is keeping your paint thin. It really does help significantly. Thick layers of paint just look awful, especially under the camera, and they tend to pull up quite easily too when you add the next layers. In terms of the berets, there are a couple of different possibilities. Royal Marines in World War II who had done the commando course would wear the green beret, but in that time period not every Marine had done the commando course, and therefore some of them would also wear the blue berets. And that's what I went for here. It's a bit of an old school technique, but I also did some dry brushing on the figures, only very lightly, with a lighter shade of the base coat. And with that, everything was ready. And there we go guys, that was my build of Tamiya's 1/35th scale Centaur, along with a 3D printed Porpoise ammunition sledge as it would have pulled ashore on D-Day. I really enjoyed this kit. I've always liked models which are slightly different, and I think the photo etch there just sets it slightly aside from the standard Centaur model. And I like the unique features that the 3D printing enabled me to add as well. Although I did some 3D printing of some really big vehicles in a recent video, I still can't help thinking that 3D printing is best for small customizations like this, with the Porpoise ammunition sledge and with the specific ammunition crates for the 3-inch howitzer. They're just things that you can't really get in a regular kit, and they just make things a little bit different, just sort of stand out slightly. So yes, I really enjoyed this build. As I said, I would like to do a scene with the Centaur coming out of the ocean, a bit like this reference photo here, but I'm not really in the mood for it right now, and I tend to only really work on things if I feel like it, because otherwise I don't do them too well. That said, there is a poll on my community tab at the moment. It's still open, asking you to vote for the next kit I'm going to build. These are your 4 choices here, so you can head over to the community tab now to vote if you haven't done already. I would like to say thank you to everyone for watching, well done for getting this far, and special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. I really appreciate all the support everyone gives me guys, it really makes a big difference to me and the channel, so thank you very much, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Until then, have fun modelling.